Every year I see new YouTube tutorials on how to grow the best tomato plants, or how to grow bigger garlic, or how to get your carrot seeds to germinate. But something that I see almost no one talking about is how to furnish your garden with natives. Native plants are one of the least understood concepts within modern gardening because honestly, it's kind of a hard sell. By definition, native refers to a plant that grows naturally and historically in a specific ecoregion. So what might be a native for me is very likely not a native plant for you unless you happen to also be growing in the inland Northwest. Hybridized and heirloom vegetable varieties are much easier to connect with, even if you live in Wisconsin and you see someone growing them in Arizona. They're likely going to work out for you at some level. But what is the long-term effect of only growing your standard ornamental perennials and edible annuals? Well, that's what this video is going to be about. And so to start, I want to give you an image. As a Washington State resident, I'm no stranger to the dangers of wildfires. We experience an average of 900 wildfires every year. And a few years ago, this home was at risk of being burned to the ground as a fire less than a mile away ravaged the landscape and took out dozens of homes in the area. But at the beginning of 2025, there was a particularly devastating wildfire that left a scar on both the area that it devastated and on our collective imagination throughout the US, the Palisades Fire. Now, this fire was one of the most destructive wildfires in recorded California state history, killing 12 people and destroying thousands of structures, not to mention thousands of acres of natural habitat. The direct cause of the fire was arson, but the reason that the fire became so deadly is because of a number of factors that stacked up to create the perfect conditions for an uncontrollable blaze. Severe drought, intense windstorms, and a lack of adequate preparation greatly contributed to the spread of the wildfire, but the stage was also set long before due to a buildup of dry timber in the Palisades Highlands. Now, this event, just like everything else in this country, was immediately politicized. Rather than denying any one of the reasons for the damage that this tragic event caused, I am going to take the apparently radical stance that it was likely a combination of all of them. And you can go ahead and fight me in the comments if you want to on that one and boost this video for the algorithm. The reason that I bring this up, this particular example up, is because on both a micro and a macro level, many of our gardens are filled with a metaphorical dry timber. And that timber is reflected on a broad scale when we observe agriculture on the whole throughout this country. The timber, however, is not leftover dead plant debris, but the living plants growing in our gardens. And maybe more accurately, the living plants not growing in our gardens. Specifically, you probably guessed, native plants. The lack of native plants supporting native pollinators is driving them toward extinction. And that might kind of be like white noise at this point. It sort of is to me, to be honest, because I don't really feel any of the immediate effects of that gradual loss. But the stats show that over 22% of native North American pollinators are facing an elevated risk of extinction. Wild pollinators have apparently dropped nearly 50% over the past 50 years, and this brings with it some serious costs. Now, what do native plants have to do with all this? Well, the short answer is native plants feed native pollinators. On the most basic and surface level, we could point out that more than 80% of all flowering plants rely on pollinators for reproduction. Pollinators play a vital role in fertilization. They transfer pollen from a flower's male part to its female part, or from plant to plant as they gather food. This then allows the plant to develop seeds, and in many cases, a fruit that surrounds that seed. And then the life cycle of that plant species can continue. If all pollinators were suddenly gone, we would have to manually pollinate most flowering plants to get them to reproduce. Pollinators are sort of like the janitors who clean up public restrooms or the sound engineers at a concert. We won't really notice them until they're gone. But this is really just scratching the surface. Pollinators are one of the primary cogs in the spinning wheels of an ecosystem. And that term ecosystem, ecological system, is that, a system. And just like any system, if one of the cogs gets removed from the system, the whole thing starts to fall apart. And at the risk of oversimplifying this, if you take away one animal's food supply, right, that animal either dies or starts invading another animal's food supply. And then what is that animal supposed to do? Some animals help keep plant populations in check. And so removing a plant could remove an animal's food, which removes another animal's food, which allows another plant to grow uncontrolled. This is a super simple way of putting it. Hopefully you kind of get what I'm going for. But this is where supporting pollinators isn't just an environmental justice warrior sort of thing. It's highly relevant to our own gardens. Our gardens, whether we realize it or not, are actually just little systems that are tapping into the local ecosystem. We're reliant on the ecosystem to work well, and unfortunately it's working less well each passing year. But it's not like there's nothing that we can do about our local ecosystem, and that's where we come back to our question, why are native plants so important? I said at the beginning of this video that native plants are the plants that grow naturally, historically, in your region. If you were to go back 1,000 years or 10,000 years, these are the plants, or some form of them, that would be growing here. But alongside these plants, you'd see native pollinators. And to be honest, before a few years ago, if you had asked me what a native pollinator was, I would have said bees and butterflies. Reality is that depending on where you live, birds, bats, moths, flies, even beetles can be pollinating your plants. Now, I'd guess that most people know that there are more than one type of bird out there, but did you know that there are over 2,000 species of pollinating birds worldwide? And only around 360 of those are hummingbird species, which are, I think, one of the birds that I tend to think of when it comes to pollinating birds. There are also sunbirds, honey eaters, white-eyes, lories, orioles, flower peckers, even doves and pigeons can pollinate. 2,000 distinct species of birds worldwide. It might also shock you to learn that there are over 4,000 different species of bees that pollinate in North America alone, over 20,000 worldwide. Now, guess how many of those are honeybees? 8. There are 8 recognized species of true honeybees worldwide. And I mention that just because I think that a lot of people think of honeybees when they hear bees, right? They think that we need to save the bees so that we can keep getting honey. Why does this matter? Well, because each bee, each bird, each moth, bat, and beetle is going to be slightly distinct and crucial to the specific ecosystem that you are living in and growing in. All pollinators and plants co-evolved over millions of years, developing genetic traits that were precisely engineered to be mutually beneficial to one another based on your region's climate factors, your temperatures, the elevation, weather patterns. All of these living creatures developed and adapted and co-evolved to exist perfectly within their own specific ecosystem, and all was well until we kind of started shaking things up. It wasn't until I read a book called Pollinator Victory Garden that it all kind of started to click for me. In this book, the author Kim Ehrman argues that we're at a bit of a breaking point when it comes to our pollinators dying off. And as extreme as it might sound, the wartime terminology of growing a pollinator victory garden simply to feed our pollinators and win them back from the brink of extinction feels more and more appropriate to me. Have you ever heard someone say, that plant is a great pollinator attractor? And thought, okay, sure, but isn't any flower going to feed pollinators? How is that any better than any other flower? I definitely did. I also remember having questions like, why do I need more than one type of pollinator attractor? And even, how do plants attract pollinators more than others? We recently posted a video on comfrey, which is a plant that we would consider naturalized, meaning that it's not invasive, but it's also not native to our area. It has, however, found a role in our ecoregion and is therefore able to provide food for pollinators as well as fertility for our garden through its massive amount of biomass, all without aggressively spreading and taking over our garden. Birds and insects nibble on it, bees collect pollen and nectar from it. That said, as great as this plant is and as grateful as we are to be able to grow it, it really only hits a small piece of the picture when it comes to the role in feeding native pollinators for us. Let's take a look at a few other plants that are growing in our yard. Here I have 3 different weeds that are prolific here. This one is German madwort, this one is tumble mustard, and here we've got yellow salsify. Each of these plants are classified as invasive, meaning that they're not originally from here, they don't have the kind of cooperative qualities that support our native wildlife, and more than that, they actually compete with and outcompete our native plant species by stealing sunlight, water, and space. You might be thinking, well, at least they've got flowers, you can feed your pollinators. But that's the thing, they likely won't. Here in Eastern Washington, we have got hundreds of species of bees, but only a relative few of them can collect pollen from any of these. Now, in a similar way that comfrey functions as a sort of generalist plant for pollinators, we also have generalist pollinators who might be able to benefit from them. But there really aren't that many generalists by comparison, and even generalists have specific needs. All that said, just because these particular weeds are invasive in my yard doesn't mean that they are in yours. It all depends on where you live and what the native plants are that grow there. When we're talking about millions of years of genetic programming, we're looking at physical compatibility. Is the shape of the flower, the size, the petal structures going to allow the bee or the butterfly or the moth to know where to land or even to have enough space to land? And how about the nutritional availability? Pollen varies substantially in nutrient quality, and invasive species might provide pollen that lacks certain amino acids and lipids that native pollinators require. Some invasive plants even provide pollen that is great for the original pollinators that fed on them, but is chemically toxic for other pollinators. And the list kind of goes on. And so far, we've only been talking about pollen, but depending on the pollinator, it might also rely on nectar. and plant foliage for food. And my point here is really not to overwhelm you with all the factors. Flower shape, petal size, nectar versus pollen. My point is actually to point out that nature has already figured all this stuff out for you. Planting native plants alone will go a long way toward feeding your native pollinators. There are other things that you can provide for them as well, like sources of drinking water and physical homes. But if you're able to plant at least a few types of natives that provide pollen and a few that provide nectar, you're going to help your pollinator population even more. Kind of like a if you feed them, they will come sort of thing. And you can think about this like a buffet. The goal of a buffet is to give a bunch of options to please the most amount of people with various dietary preferences. Each time that you can bring in a new layer of plant diversity, you expand the buffet of options for your pollinators. Now, the obvious action step that you may have already done as you've watched this video is just to go on the internet and search native plants in my area. You're likely going to have a hard time finding these at your local Home Depot or Lowe's, so the next step would be to look up a local plant nursery and give them a call. And you can ask them if they have any of the plants that you're looking for, and if not, if they know where you might be able to find them. You don't have to go all out here. You could start with just a couple and slowly build them out from there, even potentially propagating in the years to follow. Within your plant selection, you'll have perennials, biennials, and annuals. Perennials are going to grow back the next year, obviously, from the leftover foliage. Biennials grow their leaves the first year and bloom the second and drop seeds. Annuals complete their whole life cycle in one season. Now you can collect seeds from your biennials and your annuals, or just let them self-seed, and they will most likely come back the next year, no problem. Point is, unlike your hybridized annual veggies and flowers, the native plants that you invest in don't need to be repurchased each year. They're specifically designed to live season to season to season in your area. While you're doing that kind of research, by the way, look up your city's list of designated noxious weeds and invasives so that you can stay privy to the worst of the weeds in your area. Now, if you made it to this part of the video, thank you for thinking about this with me, but you might also kind of still be thinking, okay, I get that I can help out my pollinators and maybe that will have some sort of positive effect on the local ecology. But is it really worth giving up space in my yard to stop growing food for me and start growing food for the bees? And I kind of like to think about this on sort of 3 levels in terms of the effects that planting natives could have. First level being my edible garden plants. Some of my plants at least likely need pollination. If you're growing tomatoes, squash, melons, or peppers, you will likely need some help from pollinators. If you're growing fruit trees or bushes, you definitely need them. Now, you could hope and pray that your neighbors are growing native plants that support pollinators who might pop over the fence and boop around on your veggies and fruits. But it's far better to kind of just cover your bases and get some plants specifically geared toward feeding those pollinators yourself. I'm not saying that you have to sacrifice your whole garden or even a majority of it. Even just a few types of natives can really offer a helpful source of food for your unpaid employees, the pollinators. And at the second level, beyond needing natives for pollinators, you also need beneficial insects that come in and keep pest populations under control. Native plants feed insects whose only job is to pollinate, but they also provide food for native beneficial predators. Some of these insects rely on plant foliage when they're larvae and hunt other insects when they're adults. Others start off eating other insects as larvae and then require pollen and nectar as adults. Establishing native plants is one of the best preventative measures that you can take to beefing out your local pest control population. Providing native plants also provides legitimate food for insects that might otherwise be pests, if not for the food source that you provide them with. Otherwise, you're kind of just setting the table for your native pests, and the main course are the vegetables that you're growing, presumably for yourself. On a much broader level, though, I believe that the main reason that people don't prioritize planting natives is not because they don't know how important it is, it's because of the social pressure to conform. You might not be growing natives because no one else in your neighborhood is. On the flip side, if you see your neighbor growing some thriving, beautiful native plants that are swirling with butterflies and hummingbirds, you're gonna wanna get in on that. Why don't you just become that neighbor? Any movement begins by a few people just kind of overcoming the social pressure of conformity and demonstrating a different path. The funny thing is, the natives that you grow in your garden are most likely going to be some of the best performing and most beautiful plants in your garden. You'll need to water them less, manage disease less, and they'll probably get a little nibbled at by local insects, but that's kind of the point. A few of the natives that we have invested in so far this year are lupin, milkweed, and Douglas spirea. Lupin is an example of a pea-shaped or bonnet-like shaped flower. This is a great plant for us to provide for our native bees and bumblebees. They can provide a great source of pollen, but not much accessible nectar. Milkweed, on the other hand, supports a wide range of native pollinators, most notably monarch butterflies and their larvae, but also syrphid flies and hummingbirds, and it almost exclusively provides nectar. Milkweed flowers have a pretty distinct, specialized sort of shape, and the shape also depends on the exact variety. So if you do choose to grow milkweed, make sure, first of all, that you're in North America, and then check to see which specific varieties are native to your region. As far as our Douglas spirea, this plant is hopefully going to act as a pollinator hub for bees and butterflies, but also as a support for ladybugs and parasitic wasps. They can grow quite large and serve as a refuge and an egg-laying site for beneficial insects in our area. Similar to the lupin, they provide a sort of steeple-shaped conical flower, but within those flowers, the spirea have dense clusters of hundreds of fuzzy rose-like flowers. And these three plants are just actually some of the examples of ways that we're hoping to give multiple options for pollinators who need specific types of flowers to feed from. Now again, you don't have to get this many all at once. You don't have to get any if you don't want to. But if you're wondering why you're suffering from persistent pest damage year after year, if you're trying to get more local pollinators fertilizing your fruiting plants, or if you're just interested in providing a resting place for the native insects that we've rapidly driven out of the home, at least in this country, starting to reintroduce native plants could help to address those problems. If you found this video helpful, please share it with someone who would appreciate it as well. And if you want to continue the conversation on bringing in biodiversity to your growing space, join my free natural gardening community on School. You can connect with other like-minded gardeners and maybe even find someone in your area who could point you in the right direction in choosing some natives. Thank you as always for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.